And here we are. We haven't gone very far. Penelope's still here, checking out our anteater. So, Anscombe's quartet, what do we know? Got to look at the data, as it's displayed in the scatter diagrams to understand the relationship of the variables, because this is four drastically different stories. But all these data sets had the same means for each variable, the same standard deviations, and the same regression line, and the same R. So we really need to, oh, this is not going to go well, is it? Look at what she's doing. She's crazy. Where are you going, Penelope? What are we doing here? Oh, this is about to really hurt. Can you believe it? All right. No respect. It's Rodney Dangerfield. I don't get no respect. All right. Let's look at some data then. So descriptive statistics, what do we know? If we look at, let's say, self-monitoring, as we can see the mean, then we record the median and the mode. These are all things that we want to record. We have to understand the standard deviation, the sample variance. This all comes from your futures, your stats classes, right? So self-handicapping, sales ability. These are all constructs that we might be interested in measuring of applicants. Now, self-handicapping and self-monitoring might be problematic because they kind of represent character or personality variables and not behavioral variables like sales ability necessarily. But what it allows us to do is look at our sample and understand, right, how our sample is arrayed. Now, if we look at self-monitoring, to what extent do people self-monitor? This can also give us an additional piece of information. Let's suppose, in fact, how many people do we have? We have frequency is 15, 19. This is about 35 people, let's say. We see that in the area, it's kind of bell-shaped. But if we're looking for people who are high self-monitors, right, this also gives us some interesting information. That is, if we're testing our applicants, and this is how our applicants are arrayed, we have 35 applicants, we can see that we have about 6, 7 people who are relatively high in self-monitoring and the rest not as high. If we believe that self-monitoring is a crucial characteristic for performing the job well, one other piece of information we can glean from this is if I bring in, all else being equal, about 35 applicants, I'll find about 7 who have my desired level of self-monitoring. So this is another way to get at how many people do I need, how many people should I be looking at as far as applicants, right? Do you agree? I agree. All right. So it's another piece of information that we get out of the frequency distribution, aka the histogram. Okay. So adverse impact, revisited and assessed, as we begin to collect candidates, data on candidates, and remember, we can also test measures on incumbents as well and do the same thing, right? Some questions that we need to ask. Is the measured quality normally distributed? And not that it has to be. This is somewhat of a normal distribution, but you could also argue it's bimodal, right? So that's fine. Maybe a desirable trait, right? Measure may suffer from restriction of range. And for example, in Psych and Law, if you look at the performance measure on the exams, what you see is about 35% of the class getting A's. In fact, the measure is skewed to such an extent that it's skewed like this. Not necessarily a bad thing, because in the context of the Psych and Law exam, I'm not trying to differentiate candidates, right? I'm just trying to assess performance of students. So as a different story in what I'm trying to do with the measure, right? Is the distribution bimodal? If so, analyze on the basis of the protected quality. So in this case, I see, oh my God, this is a bimodal distribution. Is there some protected quality if I separate this out on the basis, like, is this the white folks and is this the black folks? Or is this the men and is this the women? These measures then allow us to assess if people are experiencing adverse impact as a result of the measure. And in a way that's just as useful as looking at the means of each group. So we have this. Does the analysis demonstrate two different distributions on the basis of a protected quality? Now I'm going to go back to that psych and law exam, and what I see in the psych and law exam is a bimodal distribution. The highest mode, of course, is the A's. And then it dips down a little bit for A minuses, B pluses, right? And then you get to B minus and there's another mode, and then it dips off and falls. And you say, okay, so you got a bimodal distribution. Who is represented in the B minus mode and who's represented in the A mode? Could you tell me a story that explains why we have two modes? And I know it's going to sound kind of chump, but one of the easiest stories to say, well, these are the frickin' people who studied, and these are the people who didn't study, right? And so you might have an explanation for the difference in the bimodality, and that's fine on the basis of studying or not studying. But if your bimodality is on the basis of ethnicity or on the basis of gender, you better rethink the use of that measure because it's demonstrating adverse impact, right? So you might want to ditch it at that point. Now let's look at self-handicapping, and this again is a single mode. It's a very simple frequency distribution, very obvious. And then let's look at sales ability. And here we see in sales ability that it's skewed obviously in that direction. Now, what I'm interested though is, does self-monitoring, right, or self-handicapping affect sales ability in terms of the number of units sold down the road? So we go to the scatter diagram. Here we see sales ability and self-monitoring, and what we find in this, and this is a fictitious example, right, what we see then is a strong correlation of an R squared equals 0.3, which is a strong correlation, right, for self-monitoring as a predictor of sales ability within this context. So, would it be justified for me to measure my applicants' self-monitoring as a predictor of their eventual success in selling units on the job? And in this case, I could begin to make a valid argument that yes, in fact, measuring self-monitoring predicts on-the-job performance. And notice, this is where I become protected in using this measure because I have the statistical background to explain that in fact it does predict. Okay? So I can start making the argument, let's go back to this term of a bona fide occupational qualification. Now next up, sales ability and self-handicapping. Now what we see here is we see a much lower R, we see kind of a flat line. So someone's level of self-handicapping in fact does not predict their sales ability, so it would not be a valid measure for on-the-job performance within this context. And then if we want, we can kind of close the loop on this and measure self-monitoring and self-handicapping, and we see there's no relationship at all. This would be interesting if both self-monitoring and self-handicapping predicted sales ability. Then we would say, wow, two very different ways of predicting sales ability. In this case, we know self-monitoring does. It has no relationship with self-handicapping, so we're definitely not going to use self-handicapping because it buys us nothing in our idea. So the observed relationships, if we want to put them into a tabular display, and this is just then the R values as taken from those graphs, then we would look, of course, self-monitoring and self-monitoring correlate perfectly because it measures the same thing. But now we can look at this in the tabular format. So when you present the information, what you're going to do is present it in both ways. The scatter diagrams should, have your summary table first and then use the scatter diagram second so people can drill down and look at it a little more specifically. So again, we can try it. You can pick 3 constructs from your repertory grid analysis that served additionally as a basis for the find and measure assignments, so it kind of ties all those in. For each of those 3, what aspect of performance would you measure to assess the incumbent's performance and what might be measured, right? And that's what we got in the repertory grid. What would your predictive measure for that construct? We can get that from our find and measure assignment. What relationship would you expect to see? And you should always have a prediction about the relationship. That means you know about your measures and you know what you're attempting to predict, right? Label a scatter diagram and draw a trend line for each of the 3. you know, it's kind of silly, but it'll demonstrate one's grasp of the concepts, right? So, other assignment guidelines, check on Carmen, and that's the basics. So you can look at this at some future point, but really I want it to get you a leg up on your find and measure assignment. And that's it for the basics. Next time we're going to dive in a bit deeper, and we're going to look at the dispersion, z-scores, etc. So we're going to call this one good. Thank you very much.